Thank you so much to everybody for joining us, and thank you specifically to Busani for allowing us, the China Academy, to collaborate with the National School of Government in hosting this webinar. We will begin by a speech from Kishore, please.
Thank you very much, Shelby. I want to thank you and Professor Busani for inviting me to this forum, and I'm happy to join you to talk about whose century is it anyway. And what I propose to do is make some opening remarks for about 5 to 10 minutes to give my point of view, and I look forward to getting the reactions. Let me begin by explaining why I believe that the 21st century will be the Asian century. And by the way, I was going to say that I discovered by accident that many people around the world agree with me, because when I came out with an open access book, a free book called The Asian 21st Century in January 2022, I asked the publisher, the German publisher Springer Nature, how many copies do you expect to be downloaded? He said, if you can get 20,000 copies downloaded, it'd be a good result. But instead of there being 20,000 copies downloaded, there have been over 3.9 million copies downloaded since the book was released 3 years ago. So clearly, people around the world are psychologically preparing for this Asian 21st century. And for those who are listening in, I would encourage you to download the book for free. It's called The Asian 21st Century, because it's got lots of information about Asia that may be relevant to all of you. So in discussing the Asian 21st century, I'm going to divide my remarks into 3 parts. In part 1, I'll talk about why I remain confident that the 21st century will be the Asian century. And then in part 2, I'll talk about the challenges that we will face in the Asian 21st century. And finally, conclude by talking about prospects and what may be coming. And as I said, I'll do this in the 5 to 10 minutes that you have assigned to me. Now, firstly, in terms of why I am absolutely confident that this will be the Asian 21st century, I make 3 points. First, of course, is that from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the 2 largest economies of the world have always been those of China and India. So you can see, therefore, that the past 200 years of Western domination of world history have been an aberration. All aberrations come to a natural end, and that's why it's perfectly natural to see the return of Asia in the 21st century. But the second reason why I'm confident that it'll be the Asian century is that the Asian countries finally woke up and realized, asked themselves a basic question: why did the West succeed? And what can we learn from the success of the West? So in another book of mine, The Asian 21st Century, I pointed out that the Asian countries are succeeding because they finally absorbed, understood, and implemented 7 pillars of Western wisdom. So I can say this quite honestly, we in Asia are succeeding because we learned from the West, and we should actually thank the West for sharing some of its wisdom. And I'll give you a couple of simple examples. One, the obvious one, is mastery of science and technology. The reason why the West could conquer and colonize the world in the 19th century and 20th century was because they had superior science and technology. Today, the mastery of science and technology still remains strong in the West, but it is also moving very quickly into Asia. And in many areas, Asian scientists are doing better than Western scientists. And this is one example. Secondly, of course, the second Western pillar of wisdom that we've taken full advantage of is the principle of free market economics. And this is a gift, of course, from Adam Smith, the Scottish philosopher. But today, paradoxically, the Asian countries believe more in free market economics than, paradoxically, the United States, which was the country that gave so many of the ideas in support of free market economics, today is a country, especially under Donald Trump, that is incapable of signing a free trade agreement. And the third the third reason why I'm confident it'll be the Asian century is that there has been, especially because of the successes of the last few decades, an enormous boost in the psychological self-confidence of Asians in many, many different corners of Asia. In fact, today, if you want to meet optimistic young people, don't go to Europe, because many young Europeans feel that they have a bleak future for themselves. They don't believe that they'll have a better future for themselves. By contrast, in many parts of Asia, in China, India, in Southeast Asia, many of the young people believe that their future will be better than those of their parents. So, that is an important reason for continuing development. You need to have psychological self-confidence. But having explained why I'm confident with the Asian 21st century, one lesson I've learned in life is that nothing in life is a smooth road. There'll be ups and downs and there'll be challenges. And certainly, Asia is going to face lots of serious challenges as we march towards the Asian 21st century. Most of the challenges come from geopolitics. So, for example, even as we are speaking, the US and China have begun a major geopolitical contest. If you look behind my left shoulder, there's a book called Has China Won, in which I describe why the US-China geopolitical contest will accelerate over the next 10, 20 years, because the United States is conforming to an iron law of geopolitics, which says that when the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which today is the United States, the world's number one power will always push down the world's number one emerging power. And so that's what's happening nowadays. And you will see that it doesn't matter whether you have a nice president like Joe Biden or a not so nice president like Donald Trump, makes no difference. The US-China contest will continue because it's driven by structural forces, as I documented, as China won. But I also want to emphasize that there are other geopolitical tensions in the region between China and Japan to some extent. There's some discomfort between China and India. There are problems within India and Pakistan. So, there are lots of challenges in Asia, and Asians got to pay attention to these challenges if they're going to succeed. But having said all that, having talked about the challenges, I still remain very optimistic that the Asian regions will do very well, because there's a lot of momentum that has developed in Asia in the area of development. Now, everyone knows how much China has developed, and I think everyone should know this statistic. In the year 1980, the European Union's combined GNP was 10 times bigger than China. Today, European Union is the same size as China. By 2050, European Union will be half the size of China. Isn't that amazing? In one lifetime, European Union can go from being 10 times bigger than China to becoming half the size of China. That's an example of how the Asian century is coming. Another example, I live in Southeast Asia, and you all must, if you don't mind, study ASEAN, which is the second most successful regional organization in the world after the European Union. In the year 2000, Japan, which was the second largest economy, was 8 times bigger than ASEAN in the year 2000. Now Japan is only 1.3 times bigger than ASEAN. By 2030, ASEAN will be bigger than Japan. Okay. You see how the growth in Asia is taking place so dramatically, very dramatically. That's why I'm so confident that the 21st century will be the Asian century. So with that, I covered my 10 minutes. So I'm looking forward to the discussion and to the question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kishore. I'll move very quickly and to pass it on to Professor Busani and for your panel of experts from South Africa.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Prof, for those opening remarks. I've read both books on the Asia 21st century, and the one that says China has won. One thing you forgot to write, though, as China has won book, you forgot to write who has lost if China has won. But anyway, we've got some interesting people here. We've got Professor Siphamandla Zondi, who's a scholar who's been studying Africa for over 30 years now. So we'll have him first make an intervention. He's a professor at the University of Johannesburg. He will then be followed by Ms. Muleta, who is in Addis Ababa, who is an advisor in the office of the mayor in Ethiopia, who's interacting with many Asian countries. We'll have both of them engaged back to back. Then we'll go back to you, Prof. Mahbubani. Professor Zondi.
Thank you so much, Professor Mahbubani, and for your reminding us of what the Asian 21st Century book is actually saying. There's four things I would like to say very quickly. Of course, you are right that the century belongs to Asia. If for any reason, the most important reason is the resurgence of Asia, the rise again of Asia, according to all indicators we can think of. And that rise has been consistent, has gone on for a while now, and the trajectory continues to look upward. I agree with you, continue to look upward. And the fact that it has a number of drivers of this change. It's not just China, but there's India, Japan continues to be significant. There is a number of Southeast Asian states that are also rising in a big way. But I also agree with you that there are serious challenges also that face. One challenge for me is that while Asia has taken out hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, Asia continues to face very sharp inequalities. And those can become a huge threat to this continued rise of Asia. The second one is the relationship between free market economy and liberal democracy, which remains very uncertain in this particular part of the world. Whether the model of governance that it is adopted in that region, which continues to shift quite a lot of time, can sustain this growth and projection going forward. The third one is in relation to the point you make in the book about the decline of the West, and we've all seen it and its stagnation and all of those kinds of things. But the relationship between key Asian states and this Western world order, that might not disappear, by the way. It may look like it's declining, but may not finally fully decline. Almost, the idea of the old is struggling to die and the new is not being fully born. Now, in the context where we're not quite sure what emerges out of the post-Western world, Asia is hard-pressed to indicate whether it wants to assert its global power and underwrite a global rise. But Asia is generally hesitant in that regard. And that might leave it in conditions of stagnation in global world, and that might affect Asia itself. Is it possible, in other words, for Asia to just rise peacefully and not assert itself? Peacefully in the sense of trying not to rattle the feathers, trying not to upset the apple cart. Not quite sure whether that is possible. The rise of Asia will be sustained by growing multipolarity in the world. But we are not quite sure if we are becoming a multipolar world as anticipated. So those are some of the things that, for me, creates questions that must continue to be raised. You mentioned geopolitical tensions. There are also internal tensions, ethnic and religious conflicts, questions of corruption, authoritarianism in the region. There is also a challenge of debt crisis, I've already mentioned wealth disparities. And it's very significant. If you look at countries like China, Japan, South Korea, now more interesting countries, are experiencing declining birth rates. And that is threatening their future economic growth. So an aging population and a stubborn youth unemployment. If you look especially at South Asia, that is a big issue, but it's also present further down. Asia itself, like we talk about in Africa, about dependence on China as one important condition for us to continue to rise, because we can co-emerge. But it can also be a trap. It creates risks. Should China experience an economic downturn, it takes us with downward. But Asia has the same problem, just as Europe and others do. I am not fully convinced that Asia has a unified identity of some form, at least in relation to geopolitics, geo-economic, strategic issues by which it can protect its rise and its continued rise. I'm not quite sure that it has shaped it, and I'm not quite sure in the absence of that what would then be the basis for further growth. And there is also an issue of massive migration in Asia, the kind we have not seen anywhere in the world, especially urban migration. And that puts all manner of pressures on the life system. Lastly, for me, it would be the issues related to environmental and climate changes in that particular part of the world, and whether these might not present a stumbling block to all of this. Now, I want to say possibly the 22nd century might become Africa's century too, on the basis of a sense that Africa is rising and has been rising across a range of indicators as well. A strong demographic dividend that Africa has a much better demographic dividend than any part of the world, and a strong sense of voice and agency and a unified identity, an identity. And that Africa is a laboratory of world solutions today. Asians use Africa, the West use Africa to design solutions. And Africa, if it is strategic, it can take advantage of that. Africa may soon become the factory of the world as factories move from other areas where it becomes more expensive to maintain because of the cost of labor and so on. And of course, the West is in decline and Asia is settling down. But for Africa to do this, it would need a huge improvement in governance, stronger institutions, more innovative leadership, an entrepreneurial spirit, and most importantly, what Kishore mentioned earlier, we would need a much better self-confidence. And actually, self-confidence is the biggest differentiator between Africa and Asia. Asians, for many reasons, over a period of time, for almost 80 years now, have shown a lot more confidence, both in their abilities to rise, in their own capabilities, in their own culture and own civilization, while embracing other civilizations, than we on the African continent has been able to do. And there are clear reasons why that is so. But that has to turn around if 22nd century is going to be Africa's century. But thank you very much for stimulating thought, and I hope this will help us to think about how do we co-emerge, how do we take advantage of emergence happening at the same time. Thank you.
Prof. Kishore, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I think that was a very thoughtful presentation by Professor Zondi, and I think he's right that, you know, in a short space of time, you can't touch on all the subjects, and you're right that there is that Asia faces lots of challenges, environmental challenges, migration challenges, identity challenges, and the challenges don't go away overnight. But the question is only whether or not any of these challenges are in many ways derailing the forward momentum of the Asian societies. And so far, as far as I can tell, the growth story in Asia carries on in a fairly dramatic fashion. And certainly there are, as I mentioned, as I considered myself, there are geopolitical challenges, there's multipolarity in Asia, and we got to manage that. But, so far we've had no major war in Asia since 1979. So that's already 46 years of no major war in Asia. I mean, no major interstate war. And by contrast, all the major wars are taking place in Europe. And as you know, I just published a piece in the magazine Foreign Policy about 10 days ago, saying the time has come for Europe to realize that it is becoming geopolitically incompetent. And by contrast, Asia is showing more geopolitical competence. And so in that sense, I would say if you watch how pragmatic and careful the Asian countries are, I think we can handle many of the challenges that Professor Zondi brought out very well in his remarks. Thank you.
In your intervention, Prof. Kishore, there's something you have not mentioned, and I know you've written about it for a while now. So in your contrast of what's happening in Europe and what's happening in Asia, and you make reference to their geopolitical strengths. But what you didn't mention is this thing, which is what we have spoken about for a while now, and I decided to put it here. Is in one of your conversation, you asked this question in our conversation in Shanghai with Zhang Weiwei. You made this argument that China succeeds because of government, India succeeds despite of government.
India is a very, very different society from China. I'll give you one example. They say that China succeeds because of its government, and you documented this. India succeeds despite its government.
The question, therefore, is it possible that somewhere in the middle of the story of this success, as you speak about, that is the issues of state capacity, and you haven't made a reference to it yet. I mean, I know it's a subject you write a lot about. Is that part of the foundation that will pivot Asia to win in the 21st century as opposed to other countries and other regions in the global south?
Well, I do speak about how to promote good governance. And, one of the things I say that there's a secret formula from Singapore, which I share free of charge to everybody. And the secret formula is called MPH. MPH doesn't stand for miles per hour. MPH, M stands for meritocracy, where you choose the best people for government and makes a big difference. P stands for pragmatism, where you are willing to learn from other countries and copy practices from other countries. And H stands for honesty. So any country that can implement meritocracy, pragmatism, and honesty can succeed. And what's interesting is that I spoke with Zhang Weiwei probably in the year 2017, almost 8 years ago, when I was in Fudan University with him, 2018, I think. And it's interesting that since then, India's government, as you notice, has become far more stronger under, as you know, Prime Minister Narendra Modi. His government is driving development very, very, very strongly. So actually, what both China and India share in common is very strong leadership and very strong governance that is helping their development. And that's why most people are optimistic for the future of China and India.
And where does this leave Africa, in your view?
Well, I think it's good for Africa to do what Asians did. We were happy to go and learn from the Western countries, learn the pillars of Western wisdom, and apply it to our countries. Of course, you've got to adapt everything to your own country. So, for example, the rule of law in China is not the same as the rule of law in the West. But nonetheless, some of the principles are applied by China in the rule of law. So in the same way, I would say it's good for African countries to copy Asian countries and go and learn from the West and learn from all countries in the world on what can be done. Because right now, you can see very clearly which countries are succeeding and which countries are not. So it's very simple. Just like in football, you go and learn from the football teams that win, and you don't learn from the football teams that lose. In the same way, in development, you go and study the development of countries that are growing economically and not the ones that are not growing economically.
Let me get Ms. Ledet from Ethiopia. There's a lot of interesting things that are happening in Ethiopia lately. And in fact, part of the growth story of Ethiopia is linked to how Ethiopia is learning from Asian countries, including, China and Singapore. She works in the mayor's office in Addis. That's one African city that you wouldn't recognize if you were last there 10 years ago. Ms. Muleta, what is your reaction to this input from Kishore?
Thank you. This is a wonderful, interesting conversation, and I think we all agree that this century is an Asian century, and one of the greatest things, as Professor mentioned, is that the fact that it's an Asian century really helps and supports African countries because we have so many things in common as well when we're talking about experience sharing. Some of the areas that Africa and Asia share, when it comes to culture, when it comes to colonial history, rapid population growth. Our population are predominantly youth. And our natural resources as well. Africa and Asia have a lot in common. And the challenges as well, with our diversity, with our culture, we also have challenges with ethnicities and governance and so forth, some of the things that we do share. So to see that it's a century that Asians are succeeding or Asia is succeeding and middle class population is increasing and their diplomacy around the world is as influential as it is today. It's really inspiring for African countries. Africa is able to aspire because of seeing a continent like Asia achieve what it has achieved already. In regards to Ethiopia, this is something that Ethiopia is doing. Currently, it has the non-aligned diplomacy where Ethiopia is focused on making sure that sovereignty is a top diplomacy agenda, as well as not being dependent of any particular bloc. So giving it a good, fair balance to diplomacy, which is something that it has taken from the Asian continent. This kind of secures the economic future of the country. And as you know, there are a lot of development work being done in Ethiopia, and China being one of the largest development partners. We also have had the Prime Minister of Ethiopia traveling to countries such as such as Singapore, Malaysia, and so forth, and sending leadership to get experience in regards to development, and Ethiopia is applying those experiences. So in general, I see that the fact that the century is for Asia indirectly supports Africa significantly and gives a lot of hope for Africa. And I believe that there's a lot of lessons to be learned. No war since, for decades in Asia means potential time invested, energy invested, finances invested on growth. So that's an area that Africa has a huge lesson to learn and to adapt. So I think overall, it's very important that we are even having this conversation. So thank you for this opportunity.
Prof, do you want to react to that?
No, I want to thank you for the wonderful comments you made. And you're right. I was happy to hear that, people from Ethiopia are going to visit Asia visit Southeast Asia, visit Singapore, visit Malaysia, visit Indonesia, because there are lots of in some ways, if you visit the developed countries, you can't learn very much from them because they've come a long way, from where they were in the past. But many of the Asian countries are just now emerging from poverty, emerging from many of the challenges of development. So in some ways, Asian experience is in many ways more relevant to African countries. So the fact that more and more Africans are coming to study in Asia is, I think, a very good sign.
May I very quickly squeeze in to ask a question here? And to Busani, I know this came up in one of the conversations we had in Shanghai when we met a couple of months ago. And the best part about this is Asia, Africa talking directly. But given what is happening in geopolitics today, if I can ask Kishore and the panel from Africa here, let's very quickly address the elephant in the room here. Does U.S. opposition to BRICS integration, Africa integration, Asia integration will become in any way a challenge to the African century and the Asian century that we are talking about here?
Should I respond maybe briefly first?
Please.
Well, I think it's a bit too early to tell. As I was saying, it's too early to tell what will be the long-term effects of the Trump presidency. Certainly, there's a major disruption going on. And certainly, he's not behaving like traditional US presidents. He has, for example, refused to send his Secretary of State to the G20 meeting that I think took place in South Africa. So there are things he'll do like that which are disruptive. But it's at the same time, some of these things may not have any kind of long-term change in direction. So, for example, even though Donald Trump wants to walk away from multilateralism is still a sunrise industry. The world is shrinking. We are becoming a small, interdependent global village. In any global village, you need village councils. And so the need for the UN remains as strong as ever. So I don't see the UN disappearing or other international organizations disappearing. In fact, what Trump may do is actually strengthen some of the multilateral organizations. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries realized that if they had to deal with Donald Trump alone, it'd be very difficult. But if ASEAN, all 10 countries, stick together, then we can deal with Donald Trump with some, buffer. So that's why, in some ways, even though Donald Trump may have the effect of weakening some multilateral organizations like the World Health Organization, which he has left, or the World Trade Organization that he's threatening, but I think other regional organizations like ASEAN may become stronger under Trump because they believe they have to come together to deal with Donald Trump.
Prof. Zondi, maybe you want to answer that?
A quick one. Global geopolitical rivalries have a negative bearing on Africa's rise. Always does. Of course, Africa can always take advantage of the rivalries, and that's how you took advantage of the rivalry between China and the West and built up our economic relations with Asia. We had the new Africa-Asia partnership. Then we had new strategic partnerships with China, with Japan, with Korea, with Indonesia, with Malaysia. We took advantage of that. But it's not fully sustainable for us if it is not both the West and the East. For us, the strategic advantage is that non-aligned position which enables us to build productive relationship to different extent with both sides. And now Trump is sharpening those contradictions, going to make it a little bit difficult for Africa. But it's going to also make it difficult for Asia. I remember learning just at school how Asia was assisted by the United States. The United States underwrote Japan's recovery, 1940s, South Korea's boom, Taiwan's growth, very critical for export markets in Japan, South Korea, China, and Vietnam, right from the 1970s. when the U.S. formalized relationship with China as a major global economy, had a critical role in at least not opposing, not standing against, but enabling Asia's thing. So it has a critical role to play in there. When it changes like this, Asia also has to figure out how does it adjust to this change. We have our own challenges, and they're much bigger and they're much deeper. They are relating to our inabilities to stick to our non-aligned status, because room is not always provided for that to happen.
My concern about what's happening right now is that the disruption, of course, got many advantages, on the healthcare side and so on, because it is challenging African leaders to rethink their own development pathways and trajectories away from the dependence on the aid and things like those. So there might be in the medium to long term some advantages, the upside of some of the disruptions that are occurring. But my biggest concern is the pace and rate at which we are building strong and dynamic institutions in Africa, in particular. This follows a period of what did not necessarily happen in Asia, but happened in Africa and Latin America, which is what I call the de-skilling of leadership. That to the extent that you look at various countries in the global south, you will find that they might not have the most skilled and the most competent leaders in other regions, certainly Asia will have, because of the dependence on consultants and the dependence on donor organizations, and that there was a hollowing out of state institutions which then build this type of dependence. And to the extent that we are not rebuilding dynamic state capabilities at a rate and pace at which the contemporary moment requires, we might not be able to fully recover as rapidly as we should from some of the major disruptions that are taking place. Just during the period at which there is an agreement, look at how the world responded after 2008 shocks and how it responded after the pandemic, that there is now an understanding and that the neoliberal consensus is on a retreat, and understand that the role of the state matters, and not just the state that is regulating markets and dealing with market failures, but the state that dynamically intervenes to advance and promote growth and development in the same manner in which Kishore and others have written about ASEAN and how these bureaucracies were able to enable, growth through market-oriented policies, and they were still regulating, they were still making these decisions because these are political parties. But the effective manner in which they were managing their core responsibilities played a critical role in making those advances. And so with this mega disruption taking place, my concern is that some of the African countries that will be directly affected by what's happening in Washington may postpone or may delay their abilities to recover, precisely because the institutions are weak, the politicians are a bit skilled, the bureaucracies are in disarray in many instances. Let me allow Anthony Julius has got a question as we go towards the end. Anthony, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you very much, Busani. Anthony Julius here. The question I have is around the self-confidence, Prof, when you made reference, should I put on my camera? Confidence, which is an important factor that you say is to contribute to growth. Now, is the self-confidence a function of growth, that you first need the economy to grow before you can develop the self-confidence, or can you develop self-confidence in a low growth environment? And I'm asking the question in the context of the South African experience. We may have had the Madiba factor in 1994, and we've had growth for a period, and then our growth fell away.
Well,
is it possible to think of the self-confidence as growth being associated?
Well, if I can just quickly respond. If you look at my memoirs, Living the Asian Century, I begin by telling the story of my life when I was a child growing up in Singapore in a British colony. And I, as an Asian child in a British colony in Singapore, I believed that I was mentally, culturally, intellectually inferior to the white man. The white man was up there, always brighter, smarter, and all we had to do is look up to the white man, and we Asians, we were inferior. That's what I believe as a child, okay? You read my memoirs, it's all there. But gradually, as I studied, as I did well in school, I began to understand, hey, the white man is not necessarily superior. Actually, he's the same. We can perform just as well. And I can tell you subsequently, after Singapore began to succeed and did very well in economic development, and certainly after Singapore did much better than the United Kingdom, in economic development, I asked myself, why is it as a child, I believe that these English people were superior to me? Why? But you see, you have to live through the experience. You have to experience the inferiority, which I did very profoundly, and then grow yourself, succeed in what you're doing, develop the self-confidence, and then you begin to challenge, and then over time, you develop the psychological self-confidence. So certainly, you have to have some degree of success if you're going to sustain that self-confidence that you develop among yourselves. And I think that can be done. You can find areas in which you can succeed, and that will boost your self-confidence.
Well, Prof, Professor Ngcaweni made an argument when he was asked about why Germany and Japan recovered so quickly after the war, because they were so ashamed of what happened to them, that the humiliation that occurred to Japan and Germany after the war served as a propeller to inspire them to do things better, more, and faster. So is it possible that in thinking about what's happening in Africa, for an example, that we can change the experience of shame and rage into something that could inspire innovation in terms of how we govern our economies?
Can I ask, have you seen the film Naja, the new Chinese film? It's an animation film, but it's very much a political statement of the century. It is essentially about the rise of the rest. So if you have seen it, a quick comment, just very interested from our audience.
You want to make your closing statements, Prof?
Thank you all very much for organizing this discussion. And this is one, I must say, COVID had many bad consequences, but one of the good consequences of COVID, I discovered, was that we have Zoom conferences. And also the other thing that I discovered about COVID is that as a result of these Zoom conferences, when you put the video on YouTube, you'll be amazed at how these videos can travel. And some of the videos that I did of the statements that I made sitting either in my office as I am now at home, actually travel very widely with videos and with YouTube. So if you want to reach out to a larger constituency, organizing conferences like this can be a valuable way of getting the ideas out. And I want to emphasize also, maybe I'll make this my last important point. People in Asia do want to see the success of Africa. In fact, I can tell you that today is Thursday in Singapore. On Saturday, I'm flying out to 5 countries in Africa. I'm going to South Africa. I'm going to Uganda. I'm going to Zambia. I'm going to Ghana. And then I'm going to Botswana. 5 countries in 10 days. And because I'm on the board of a company actually that is investing in Africa and believes that there is tremendous potential for development in Africa. And if there's one easy thing one easy lesson that Africans can learn from Singapore, which is that foreign investment makes a huge difference to the growth and development of a country. I mean, one of the statistics that will shock all of you, as you know, China has got 1.4 billion people and is a $18 trillion economy. Japan has got over 100 million people, and it's a $3 to $4 trillion economy. South Korea has got 40 over million people. It's a $1 to $2 trillion economy. So these economies are so much bigger than Singapore, right? But there has been more American investment in Singapore than in China, Japan, South Korea combined, right? It's so small. So if you want to understand why Singapore developed, we said, okay, we'll open the doors to foreign investment. And we opened the doors to foreign investment when everyone closing the doors to foreign investment in the 1960s, 1970s. So there are many easy ways of marching up the path of development. And I hope that this is why I hope that many Africans will come to Asia, to not just to Singapore, but to Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam is an amazing success story, okay? Vietnam has experienced more war than any other country did in the 20th century. It fought the French, it fought the Americans, it fought the Chinese, and despite over 50 years of war, South Vietnam is emerging as a tiger economy for many reasons, but one of the reasons is it's in inviting foreign investment. So there are lots of lessons you can learn from Asia, which I think will be good for the African countries. And I'm very glad that I participated in this conference, and I wish you great success with your future conferences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.